Laura Andronova, Dark Tropes. Flora Andronova by Dark Paths. The earth fell easily through his fingers, not dirtying his skin, remaining hanging in the air as a grey cloud. Peeling off the top layer, Pete stood up, glanced at his watch. He shook off his jeans and slowly, as his grandfather had taught him, ran his hand over the grave. It echoed, muffled, disgruntled, unwilling to let the lodgers go. By dark paths, light paths come out of the twilight. Break the chains, the boy muttered, not taking his eyes off the exhausted sheet of his school notebook. The soil moved slightly. Pete looked down fearfully and flipped the cheat sheet to the other side. The black Moravos marked ashes. A crack ran across the ground, ever widening. Something shiny and crimson flashed vaguely in the opening gap, and it scurried about, looking for a way out. The gravel rustled. Bow again to the sun that has gone, in a shorthand. Pete finished and skulked behind the nearest tree. The night sky was split by scarlet lightning, and for a second it became completely bright. Crosses and statues, solemn crypts and wooden pews became visible, and the distant forest and church became visible, as if their backs were turned to a lonely grave without a headstone. Pete barely had time to press himself against the rough, resin-smelling trunk before the cemetery shook. The crows cawed, and the neighborhood dogs howled in unison. A hand reached out of the ground and grabbed a tuft of grass. "Lord, Lord," clasping his eyes, the lad whispered. Then he remembered what his grandfather had said about prayers, and cut himself short. He decided to open his eyes only when the cackling and howling stopped. It was dark and quiet again. The lantern was flickering. The wind was whipping the wrapper of a frostbitten man along the path. A tall, slouchy man in a pre-war suit and new but clay-stained shoes stood swaying near the open, nameless grave. Uncertainly shaking his head, he took a step, then another, and suddenly began to fall on his side on the stiff, neatly trimmed bushes. Before he could fall, thin, boyish hands clasped the resurrected man by the shoulders. "Grandpa," Pete said. He buried his nose in his jacket, familiar from his childhood, and cried. The old man came to his senses halfway down the highway. He ran his palm over his face, sneezed, took a plaid handkerchief out of his pocket, and blew his nose hard. He looked around at Barmacha, saying something unintelligible. A frown stopped on the Peter. "What do you think you're doing, kid?" "Grandfather." "What kind of grandfather am I to you?" The boy guiltily sniffed. "Georg." He was Georg all his life, and remained so after his death. "I meant well." "He did. Look at him. Great wannabe. Is it not enough that you wished?" The old man glared inquisitorially at his grandson. "How many days has it been?" 6. "All as taught." Georg snorted. "All as taught," he mocked. "Wow, he's very diligent. I've got it written down here." Pete timidly waved the scribbled piece of paper, word for word. "To think of it," the grandfather marvelled. "It's written down, word for word, with his own pen. And you have it written down. What's the danger of a quick revival?" Pete nodded, hunched over. "Have you tried thinking about it? Brainstorming, imagination at least a quarter of its capacity." But after all, he wouldn't listen. It took him 10 years. From the cradle, you might say, I've been pushing it in, telling, describing, explaining what's what, and all for nothing. Nothing stayed in my head. It's nothing but emptiness, mould, cobwebs, and flies. You're a fool, that's one word for it. What is the crowning glory of our proud family tree? The grandson sniffed his nose, hesitating to answer. A morshko, a squishy mushroom. Yes, our family would no longer have the glory of Heartless Bob and Alex the Insatiable. George looked around and started across the highway. Pete clung to his elbow, not daring to lag an inch behind. He was afraid of roads, even quiet, deserted ones, especially ones like this. I was scared. Besky reason, whatever you say. When you get cold in winter, set fire to the city. It's very warming, they say. Pete squeezed his grandfather's hand tighter. I'll miss you, Warmth flashed for a moment in the old man's angry gaze and immediately dissolved into the dawn chill. "Wow," he muttered. "How touching. Let's go home and figure out what to do next." The apartment greeted them with the smell of borscht, fresh bread, and the subtle, faint scent of candles. After throwing off his shoes and washing his hands, Georg sat down at the table. With a chuckle, he pushed back the Giger's codex he had opened in the middle. "Not a bad meal," he remarked. Pitt brightened and fussed. "Here's some soup, sour cream, bread just the way you like it." "What's for tea?" "Chocolate eclairs." "Is that left over from the wake or something?" "Nah, I bought new ones." Grandpa graciously nodded. "Not bad," scooped up a spoonful of beet goo, sniffed with pleasure. "Hey, why are you reaching for the sweet stuff? Put it back, you don't deserve it." The eclair returned to the dish, and Pitt sighed, simultaneously frustrated and pleased. Let him grumble, let him curse, just to be there for him, not to leave him alone. He wanted to say it out loud, but he didn't. He was afraid to. "Stand here," Georg pointed with his hunchback to a spot near the bookcase. "Okay, now answer me. Who are you?" "Pete Jansen." "That's nice. That's it?" "Necromancer," the boy stammered. The spines of the folios behind his back shimmered in all shades of time-tarnished gold. "Wonderful. At least you remember that. What is your first duty under the code?" Pete stepped from foot to foot, feeling his knees weaken, to revisit the cemeteries of the city, to put to rest, to disembowel in special cases, to summon. Spirits, did they say anything about resurrecting deceased relatives, for example? That it is a highly recommended procedure for young necromancers to bring the recently deceased back to life. Strictly forbidden. "Thanks for watching," barely audibly echoed Pete. Setting aside his empty plate, Georg pushed his mug of tea and eclairs toward him. "I'm an old man," he said sadly. "So old that I'm even dead now. My sclerosis is bothering me like hell. Can you tell me why you're being so strict?" "The resurrected one will use the necromancer's life force, and, as a result," Georg noisily gulped down a third eclair. Yes. "The result will be that the stronger one survives. The second one will fade away," Pete echoed, wrinkling his headache. His legs had weakened enough that he had to lean on a chair. Georg sipped his tea thoughtfully, ignoring his whitened grandson. "This all reminds me of something. But what is it, that damned marasmus?" He stretched, looked up at the ceiling, flipped through the codex. "Oh, right. You brought me back to life, and now one of us is definitely going to die." Grandfather cast an oblique glance at the trembling Pete. "And it doesn't take a prophet to see who." Georg got up, scooped the pale, blue-haired boy into a bundle, and carried him to the sofa. He put a pillow under him and covered him with a plaid. He came back to the table, quickly gathered the plates, and adjusted the tablecloth. Pete watched him through a veil of weakness and nausea. The hand that lay beneath his cheek was cold as stone, and his teeth were chattering. Then Grandpa sat on the edge of the couch and said, "Don't do that again." His dry hand touched the boy's forehead, and he passed out. Pete woke up the next evening. The weakness was gone. He felt so good that it could only mean bad things. Throwing back the blanket, the boy jumped up, scurried around the apartment. Grandpa was gone. Pulling on his sneakers, he ran out into the street, crossed the courtyard, and sprinted down the sidewalk. It was 2 stops on the 15 to Seaside Cemetery, but Pete didn't take buses. Not that he was afraid. No, he just didn't ride. At the gate, the boy slowed down for a minute, and then ran again between the austere flower beds along the paths sprinkled with sand. The lonely grave without a headstone was again a neat mound with a barely noticeable dent from the missing plaque. Everything was the same except for the sinister-looking black dog with burning eyes. Wagging a shabby tail, the feline strolled across the trampled grass. "Good doggy," Pete said uncertainly. The dog yawned, showing off his magnificent fangs. A frosty stench wafted from its mouth, the main sign of kitty kitty, the boy said, even more uncertainly, and was rewarded with a low, unpleasant growl. Pete vaguely remembered that a necromancer could tame a bargester, even remembered a page in a book with an ornate engraving, but there was nothing in his head except the scrappy phrase, fond of raw meat. Cautiously, keeping away from the bristling dog, he jumped the cemetery fence and ran to the nearest store. There was no raw meat in the grocery store, so Pete piled into the cart a whole array of sausages, frankfurters, wieners, and smoked meats of all kinds. The cashier looked at the haggard, russet-haired boy with surprise, took a closer look, and shuddered. "Thanks, Aunt Edith," Pete said, scattering the change into his pockets. He scooped the purchases into a bag and hurried back to the cemetery. By the grave, he dumped everything on the ground, took out a penknife, and began cutting up the meat. Cut his finger, hissed. "It's ready to eat. Your dogginess," said Pete, arranging the smoked meat on a bag. Barchester sniffed indifferently, stretched, turned his nose again, and in one leap found himself near the sausage, but, ignoring the treat, jumped to the boy, frozen with horror. "Nice doggy," he said in a trembling voice. An icy breath touched his neck. He squeezed his eyes shut and suddenly felt a dog's tongue licking his bloody palm. Opening one eye, Pete saw that the hellhound was sitting at his feet, wagging its bony, dirty, broom-like tail merrily. "Close," the boy ordered, importantly, and the barghest obediently trotted after him. A couple hours later, when it was quite dark, Pete was ready for the ritual. He stood over the grave, held out his hands, and spoke. By dark paths, light paths. This time, the resurrected one woke up in the apartment. He moved, blinked, and found himself sitting at the kitchen table. Pete was standing at the stove, busily frying cutlets. At his feet, Julio Bargest was begging for meat scraps. You traitor!" Georg muttered, and prophylactically slapped the dog on his skinny ass. He snarled and hid under the sink, squinting his fiery black eyes resentfully. "Grandpa," Pete rejoiced, "we're going to eat now." "Eat? I've had enough of you and your tricks." "Wait a minute. When are you going to calm down? Wasn't yesterday enough for you? Almost killed me." Pete turned off the gas and wiped his hands with an embroidered piece of black brocade, clearly of funeral origin. "I've got it all covered. You think I'm having so much fun bouncing back and forth from coffin to coffin? Give me peace." "Grandpa, listen to me." The old man picked up a cutlet straight from the frying pan with his fork and said, "Listen. Why not listen, time permitting? There's still a couple hours before you drop dead." "I won't drop dead. I've been to the drugstore. Pete's been shopping. I got all kinds of stuff that should help." With a magician's gesture, he pulled out from under the table a basket filled to the top with bundles of herbs, medicines, vitamin packs, packs of coffee, cans of tonic drinks. Some of the boxes were opened, chocolate bars were halved. "What's this?" Georg squinted myopically. "Moral and root? And so is he, invigorating, uplifting, strengthening vitality. I've already taken just a little bit of everything. Uplifting, not one sign. You might as well paint the walls orange." Pete chipped in. "Does it help?" "Ah, as good as the rest of yours. Snadobi. It's like treating a fracture by wrapping an arm with a fancy ribbon. Doesn't do any good, but it feels good. It can't. There's no escape. I'm gonna eat, and then I'm gonna go back to dying." He's reaching for the mustard. "I don't know what you were hoping for. To find the ultimate revitalizer and be famous for centuries. Pete's the guiding light. Sounds good." There was silence for a while. Georg was eating his fifth cutlet. Pete sat on a stool, unable to see, staring at the sparrows chirping outside the window. Weakness came in waves, coming and going. Tapping his claws on the linoleum, the dog came to him and curled up at his feet. "I don't understand. How could you die so suddenly?" Suddenly, angry and surly, the kid spoke. "You were healthy." Georg's gaze was blank, impenetrable. Old age, you see. His heart had worn out, his lungs. And the liver? I think I've already mentioned marasmus. "Not true. You're still strong." vigorous. Was cheerful, corrected the grandfather, standing up. You had no right to leave me alone. I'm a selfish bastard, Georg agreed penitently. With far from senile swiftness, he strutted out of the kitchen and, before Pete could realize it, had jammed the door from the outside with a mop and a chair. Grandpa, let me in! You betcha. You'll run to dig me out again. The keys rattled, and Pete was left alone with the snoring dog. He didn't manage to get out of the apartment until the morning. He snapped a new collar and leash around the bargist's neck and walked to the cemetery, wondering what his grandfather had invented to prevent him from resurrecting himself. Pete stopped at an unmarked grave and stood there for a while, looking around helplessly, unable to believe what had happened. The ground was still broken, the coffin open. Georg was not in the grave. Pete rushed to the shed, searched the shelves, and found that a shovel and some rope were missing. There was a button lying on the boardwalk, a brown, old-fashioned one. He squatted beside it, holding back silly, childish tears. Where to look for his grandfather now? In the forest? In the sea? On the beach? In someone else's unknown grave? A nonsense task for an experienced necromancer is not time done, impossible for a teenager. I will become experienced. I promise. I will become famous. I will become a true master, whispered. I will find you and make it so we can both live. Riding beside him, Bargis put his paws on his shoulder and licked at his wet cheek. Pete clenched the button in his fist and stood up. Come on, he said. We should think of a name for you. The waves rustled the pebbles near a cave on a small island where only seagulls visited. After piling up the entrance, Georg tossed the shovel aside and sank back onto the rocks, counting out the last beats of his heart. Under his head, he placed the plaque he had removed from his grandson's grave a few days before the ritual. The clear inscription Pete Jansen, April 20, 2000, March 1, 2010, wasn't visible in the dark, but it was already burned into his memory. It was too early for the boy to go to the ground for the umpteenth time, Grandpa thought. Too early. Let him live a little longer, and he'll really make his family famous. I wonder if he'll ever realise what happened and remember. Damn bus, damn bus, damn bus. Georg closed his eyes and saw a russet-haired boy leading a big shaggy dog on a leash. They walked forward at a leisurely pace, looking around, dark paths, light paths,